My name is Hannah Miller. I'm in my mid 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been described as the stable one, the dependable one, the one who doesn't cause trouble, doesn't ask for much, and doesn't make scenes. If you ask the people in my family to describe me, they would probably say I'm quiet, practical, and emotionally steady. Some would say I'm boring. Others might say I'm lucky because I always land on my feet. What they wouldn't say is that I was lonely in ways that don't show up in photographs. What they wouldn't say is that in my family, love was never spoken out loud. It was measured, counted, calculated, usually in dollars. I grew up believing that if you didn't need anything, you didn't deserve anything. Praise went to the highest earner. Attention followed whoever was struggling financially or creating drama around money. And if you were financially responsible, self sufficient, and quiet about it, you became invisible, not rejected, just overlooked. People tend to underestimate me because I don't explain myself. I don't raise my voice. I don't defend my worth in group conversations. I learned early that doing well silently was safer than asking to be seen. That habit followed me into adulthood, into my career, and most painfully, into my family relationship. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing anyone or painting myself as a hero. It's about a slow emotional erosion that happens when financial pressure becomes the language of love, and how quietly stepping out of that system can change everything. Over the next few chapters, I'll walk you through how I was assigned a role I never agreed to play, how small dismissals became normalized, how being the responsible one turned into an unspoken obligation, and how, without shouting or confrontation, I made a decision that permanently altered the balance in my family. There are no villains here, just people reacting to stress, scarcity, and long held beliefs about worth. I'm not telling this story to shame anyone, least of all the people who raised me. I'm telling it because silence has a cost, and so does staying in a system that only values you when you need it financially. What unfolds is not dramatic in the traditional sense. There are no explosive arguments or sudden victories. Instead, there is distance, clarity, and a kind of quiet dominance that comes from no longer negotiating your value. If you if you've ever felt like your role in your family was defined more by what you could provide than by who you are, if you've ever been praised for being strong when what you really needed was to be cared for, then this story might feel uncomfortably familiar. Before we go any further, let me ask you, have you ever wondered whether being the reliable one came at the cost of being truly loved? To my family, I was never the problem. I was never the priority either. I was the one who showed up on time, left quietly, and cleaned up the loose ends no one wanted to deal with. The one who remembered birthdays without reminding anyone of them. The one who paid her bills early and didn't talk about it. The one who didn't borrow money, and because of that, didn't seem to need emotional support either. In our family, need created gravity. Whoever struggled financially pulled everyone into their orbit. Conversations revolved around them. Worries, advice, sympathy, even arguments. All of it flowed toward the person who was having a hard time. And I learned very early that stability was not magnetic. It was invisible. When relatives talked about me, it was always in passing. Hannah's fine. She's always good. She doesn't need help. Those sentences sounded like compliments. They were delivered with relief, sometimes even pride. But underneath them was a quiet message I absorbed without realizing it. Because you're fine, you don't require care. I wasn't excluded from family events. I wasn't mistreated in obvious ways. I was simply assigned the role of emotional background noise. Useful, reliable, low maintenance. Someone whose presence was assumed, not anticipated. At dinners, I was the listener, while others talked about promotions they wanted, debts they were worried about, and plans they hadn't figured out yet. When money came up, and it always did, my situation was summarized in a single phrase: Hannah's doing okay. No one asked how I was doing emotionally. No one asked if I felt tired or lonely or stretched thin. Doing okay financially seemed to cancel out the need for further inquiry. I internalized that logic. I learned to present myself as self contained. I didn't want to disrupt the fragile balance of attention. I didn't want to seem ungrateful or dramatic. So I stayed composed, nodded along, and kept my inner life neatly folded away. What's strange is that I wasn't resentful at first. I was proud of being the stable one. It felt adult, responsible. I told myself that this was what maturity looked like: handling your own life without leaning on others. But over time, something subtle happened. I stopped being asked for my opinion unless it involved logistics or numbers. I stopped being checked on during difficult periods because no one assumed I had them. I stopped expecting comfort from the people who loved me. Not because they were cruel, but because they were trained, just like I was, to associate worth with financial pressure. If you struggled, you mattered. If you were steady, you faded into the background. At family gatherings, I could feel myself shrinking, not physically, but emotionally. I'd sit there, present and absent at the same time, watching how money shaped the emotional hierarchy in the room. Who spoke longest? Who was interrupted? Who was reassured? Who was quietly expected to handle things? I was the one people leaned on without noticing the weight. And I let them, because invisibility felt safer than being seen and then dismissed. Because being the strong one came with a strange kind of approval. And because part of me believed that if I ever stopped being useful, I might stop being loved altogether. So I stayed in my lane. I fulfilled the role they never explicitly gave me, but consistently reinforced. I didn't realize yet that roles, once accepted, become expectations. And expectations, when tied to money, rarely loosen on their own. At that point in my life, I still believed that quiet endurance was a virtue. If I stayed patient, things would balance out naturally. That being overlooked was temporary, not structural. I was wrong about that, but I wouldn't understand why until the first small moment that made everything unmistakably clear. The first moment that stayed with me didn't look important at the time. That's why it mattered. It happened on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, one of those family gatherings that feels more like an obligation than a choice. We were sitting around the dining table, plates half cleared, coffee cooling in our cups. The conversation had drifted, as it always did, toward money. My younger brother was talking about his rent increase. Again. He was frustrated, angry at the timing, and worried about how he was going to manage. Everyone leaned in. Advice started flying. Someone offered to help. Someone else blamed the economy. It became a group effort to emotionally hold him up. I listened. I always did. At one point, someone turned to me and said, almost casually, well, Hannah wouldn't understand. She's always been good with money. It was said lightly, not unkindly, almost admiring. People nodded. The conversation moved on. And that was it. No one noticed the way that sentence landed. No one saw how cleanly it separated me from the circle. In one breath, I was recast, not as someone with experiences or struggles, but as an abstract concept, the responsible one, the example, the exception. I smiled. I even nodded a little, as if to agree. But something inside me tightened. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't anger. It was the sudden clarity of being misread in a way that benefited everyone except me. That single sentence erased the late nights I spent calculating budgets with a knot in my stomach. The fear I carried quietly about layoffs, about aging, about what would happen if I ever needed help too. I realized then that my family didn't see my discipline as effort. They saw it as nature, as if I had been born immune to stress simply because I managed it privately. And because I didn't talk about my worries, they assumed I didn't have any. What hurt wasn't that they didn't offer help. It was that they had decided I was outside the circle of care altogether. I tested something small after that. A few weeks later, I mentioned, briefly, that work had been overwhelming. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't ask for advice. I just stated it, the way others did when they wanted space to be heard. The response was quick. You'll be fine. You always figure things out. At least you're not dealing with money stress like your brother. The conversation pivoted immediately back to someone else. That was the cut. Small, clean, precise. It told me that my emotions were only valid if they came with visible instability. That my calm presentation disqualified me from care. That being capable had become a ceiling, not a strength. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't sulk or withdraw. Outwardly, nothing changed. I continued showing up, continued helping, continued listening. But inwardly, I started cataloging moments like this, quietly, without commentary. The way my opinions were bypassed was unless they involved finances. The way my achievements were acknowledged was briefly, then used as a contrast against someone else's struggle. The way my needs were reframed as inconveniences or brushed aside with reassurance instead of engagement. No one meant to hurt me. That was the most unsettling part. This wasn't cruelty, it was conditioning. In my family, money wasn't just a practical matter, it was the emotional scoreboard. And because I wasn't losing, I wasn't allowed to feel the game. That realization didn't explode into anger. It settled into something colder, more precise. A kind of awareness that, once it arrives, doesn't leave. I understood then that if I ever needed more from these relationships, I wouldn't get it by asking. The system wasn't designed to hear me, and that meant one thing. If I stayed silent out of habit, nothing would change. If I stayed visible only as the stable one, nothing would soften. So I kept quiet, but not in the same way anymore. This time, I was paying attention. After that first small cut, I told myself I was being sensitive. That's what people like me do. We minimize our reactions before anyone else has the chance to. I replayed conversations in my head, searching for intent. They didn't mean it like that. They're under stress. I'm reading too much into it. And on the surface, nothing had changed enough to justify confrontation. No insults, no raised voices, just patterns, quiet ones. The comments kept coming, spaced far enough apart to feel harmless in isolation. You're lucky you don't have to worry about money. You wouldn't get it. You've always been stable. Must be nice to not stress about things like this. Each time, it was said with a half smile, sometimes even admiration. But the effect was cumulative. It placed me outside the emotional equation, as if financial competence had stripped me of complexity. What I began to notice wasn't just what was said, but what wasn't. No one asked how I felt about the major decisions I was making. No one checked in when I went quiet for weeks at a time. No one noticed when I stopped volunteering information about my life. Because I was still showing up, still functioning, still useful. And usefulness, I learned, can disguise neglect very convincingly. I rationalized their behavior because it was easier than questioning the structure we were all operating in. I told myself families are messy, that everyone has blind spots, that this was simply the price of being the one who had it together. There was also fear underneath my logic. If I challenged the dynamic, would I become a burden? If I asked for emotional space, would it be compared to someone else's financial crisis? If I stopped being the stable one, would there still be room for me? So I adjusted instead. I became even more self contained. I edited my words. I stopped mentioning stress unless it was already resolved. I offered help before it was asked for, because that was safer than asking for anything in return. In doing so, I unintentionally reinforced the very role that was erasing me. The more I handled things quietly, the more others assumed I needed nothing. The more they assumed I needed nothing, the less they considered me emotionally. It was a loop I participated in, even as it wore me down. Disrespect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's the absence of curiosity, the assumption that your inner world is simple because your outer life looks controlled. I remember one specific moment that clarified this for me. A family member joked in front of everyone, "Hannah's the emergency fund of the family." People laughed. I laughed too. But inside, something shifted. Not because of the joke, but because no one questioned it. No one asked how that made me feel. No one wondered what it cost to be positioned that way. I wasn't a person in that moment. I was a resource. And resources are managed, not cared for. That realization was heavy, but still, I stayed quiet. I told myself this wasn't malice, that they loved me in the way they knew how. That love didn't always look the way you wanted it to. All of that was true, but it was also incomplete because love, when filtered through financial pressure, can become transactional without anyone meaning for it to. And when that happens, the people who ask for the least slowly disappear from consideration. I normalize the disrespect by framing it as practicality. I accepted being overlooked as a side effect of being easy, and I convinced myself that wanting more attention or emotional presence would be selfish, especially when others were struggling visibly. What I didn't realize then was that silence, when maintained long enough, teaches people exactly how to treat you. And by staying quiet, by smoothing things over, by never correcting the assumptions being made about me, I was helping write a script that would eventually become very hard to escape. At that point, I still believed endurance was the answer, that patience would be rewarded. that things would recalibrate on their own. But normalization is powerful, and once a dynamic becomes just the way things are, changing it requires more than words. It requires stepping out of the role entirely. I wasn't there yet, but I was closer than I thought. It didn't happen in one conversation. It never does. Roles like mine are shaped over time, through repetition, convenience, and unspoken agreement. By the time I became aware of it, the role had already settled around me like something tailored, familiar, and difficult to remove. I was the reliable one, not in a celebratory way, in a functional way. I was the person people assumed would handle things without complaint, the one who could be counted on to fill gaps, solve problems, and absorb stress quietly. If something needed organizing, budgeting, or smoothing over, eyes drifted toward me without anyone saying my name, and I responded automatically. Because saying no would have disrupted the image, and disruption felt dangerous. I noticed how expectations formed without discussion. If someone needed advice about money, they asked me, but only in private, and only when they needed something. If there was tension in the room, I was expected to diffuse it with calm logic. If plans fell apart, I was expected to adjust. But when it came to emotional recognition, I was exempt. No one asked what I wanted. No one checked whether I had the capacity. No one considered that constancy might require maintenance. It wasn't that my family didn't value me. They valued what I represented: stability, safety, a backup plan, the reassurance that someone, somewhere, had things under control. That's a powerful position to be in, but also a deeply lonely one. Because once you become the foundation, people stop noticing the weight you carry. They assume you don't feel it. The most telling part was how my presence was discussed when I wasn't in the room. I heard it secondhand once. Oh, Hannah will take care of it. She doesn't mind. She's good at that stuff. No one had asked me, but the role had already been assigned. And I had already been performing it long enough that questioning it would have seemed out of character. That's the trap of quiet competence. It becomes your personality in other people's eyes. I started to see how financial pressure in our family had sorted us into categories. There were the ones who struggled and received support, the ones who created chaos and demanded attention. And then there was me, the one who balanced things out, not emotionally, logistically. I wasn't expected to need reassurance. I was expected to provide it, to normalize instability by contrast, to be the proof that things could be handled if people just tried harder. And without anyone saying it out loud, my worth became tied to my usefulness. The moment I stopped being useful, well, no one knew what that would look like because I never tested it. I didn't challenge the role because it came with a kind of safety. As long as I stayed inside it, I wasn't criticized. I wasn't questioned. I wasn't pressured to explain myself. But I also wasn't fully seen. There's a difference between being trusted and being taken for granted. At first, I thought I was experiencing the former. Over time, it became clear it was the latter. I remember standing in my kitchen one evening, alone, realizing how tired I felt. Not physically, but morally. Tired of being dependable by default. Tired of being the solution without being part of the problem worth caring about. And still, I didn't say anything because breaking a role requires energy. And I had been using all of mine to maintain it. What I didn't understand yet was that roles don't dissolve through neglect. They solidify. The longer you play them, the more others rely on them. the more they rely on them, the more disruptive it becomes to step away. I was no longer just Hannah. I was the one who handles things. And once you become that person in a system built on financial stress, stepping out of the role doesn't feel like self care. It feels like betrayal. That realization scared me, but it also planted a question I couldn't unhear. If my value disappeared the moment I stopped being useful, what kind of love was this really? The shift didn't come with an argument. It didn't come with tears or raised voices. It came in a moment so small, so ordinary, that I almost missed it. I was sitting in my car outside my parents' house, engine off, keys still in my hand. I had just left another family dinner, another evening of listening, advising, absorbing. Nothing bad had happened. No conflict, no disrespect sharp enough to point to. And yet, I didn't start the car. I just sat there, staring at the dashboard, feeling an unfamiliar heaviness settle in my chest. It wasn't sadness, it was exhaustion without drama. I realized that if I went inside that house 100 more times like this, nothing would change. Not because my family was unwilling, but because the system worked exactly as designed. Everyone played their role. Everyone survived the way they knew how. And my role was to be endlessly capable. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. What would happen if I stopped? Not stopped loving them, not stopped caring, just stopped automatically filling the gaps. The thought was uncomfortable, almost frightening, because underneath it was another realization, one I hadn't fully faced before. I had been confusing peace with passivity. I believed that staying calm, agreeable, and quiet meant I was emotionally mature. But sitting there in my car, I saw the truth more clearly. I wasn't choosing silence anymore. I was defaulting to it. And default choices rarely protect you. I didn't make a decision that night. I didn't promise myself anything dramatic. But something internal realigned. A boundary, not yet spoken, quietly formed. I decided to start paying attention to my own reactions, not to judge them, but to respect them. That meant noticing when I felt dismissed, not explaining it away, not reframing it to make others comfortable. It meant allowing myself to feel disappointment without immediately neutralizing it. The next few weeks were subtle but revealing. I said less, not out of withdrawal but out of observation. I paused before offering help. I listened for what was expected of me rather than what was asked. And what I noticed confirmed everything. People didn't ask if I was okay. They assumed I was. They assumed I would step in if needed. They assumed I had endless capacity. When I didn't immediately respond, there was confusion, not concern. That distinction mattered. It told me that my presence had become functional, not relational. And instead of confronting anyone, I let the silence exist. That was new for me. I wasn't punishing anyone. I wasn't trying to prove a point. I was simply giving myself permission to stop preemptively smoothing things over. In doing that, I felt something unexpected: clarity. Without the constant performance of competence, I could see the dynamic for what it was: not malicious, not abusive, but deeply imbalanced. Financial pressure had trained everyone to triage attention. Crisis received care, stability received expectations. And I had been volunteering myself as infrastructure. That night in the car marked the end of something, not outwardly, but internally. The end of unquestioned participation. I didn't yet know what I would do differently. I only knew I couldn't keep doing the same thing and call it peace. Real peace, I realized, includes yourself. That understanding didn't make me angry. It made me calm in a way I hadn't felt before. Not resigned, resolved. For the first time, I stopped hoping that things would naturally balance out. I understood that balance doesn't appear on its own. It's chosen, and that choice, once made quietly, begins to change everything, whether anyone else notices or not. After that night, my silence changed shape. Before, it had been automatic, something I slipped into without thinking, the way you learn to avoid puddles on a familiar street. Now it was deliberate, measured, intentional. I didn't announce anything. I didn't set boundaries out loud. I simply stopped volunteering myself as the solution. That distinction mattered. When conversations drifted toward money problems, I listened, but I didn't jump in with advice unless someone asked me directly. When plans were made that assumed my availability, I asked clarifying questions instead of rearranging my schedule. When someone hinted that they needed help, I waited to hear the request in full. The response was subtle but immediate. People hesitated. They filled the silence themselves. They adjusted, awkwardly at first. What surprised me most was how quickly my quietness was reinterpreted. She's busy. She's distracted. She's probably fine. No one asked why I had changed. They simply absorbed it into their existing understanding of me. And that told me something important. They weren't deeply invested in my internal world. They were invested in my output. So I continued. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped cushioning my choices with reassurance. I didn't withdraw emotionally. I just stopped overfunctioning. And the more I did that, the clearer the dynamic became. My silence created space. And in that space, other people's expectations became visible. There were moments when someone would look at me mid-conversation, clearly waiting for me to step in, to offer a sensible plan. The calming perspective, the financial logic. I held eye contact. I said nothing, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. Those moments were uncomfortable for them and for me. But discomfort isn't damage, it's information. What I learned was this. My family didn't mistake my silence for strength. They mistook it for availability with a delayed response. They assumed I would still come through eventually. That assumption was the final confirmation I needed, because it meant the system would not correct itself through subtle cues. It required something more fundamental, a change in participation. I began to see how much emotional labor I had been performing without acknowledgement, how much smoothing, anticipating, and absorbing I had done to keep things easy for everyone else. And once I stopped doing it, the imbalance surfaced, not as conflict, but as confusion. People stumbled over conversations. Decisions took longer. Tension lingered instead of being quietly managed. No one blamed me. No one confronted me. But no one adjusted their expectations either. That was the paradox. My silence, once strategic, became invisible again, this time as something to be worked around rather than understood. And that's when I realized something crucial. Silence alone doesn't shift power dynamics, it only reveals them. What others mistook for weakness wasn't my quietness, it was their belief that I would always be there to compensate for discomfort. They had never seen me opt out. And opting out doesn't require noise, it requires consistency. So I stayed calm, I stayed polite, I stayed present, but not pliable. I began redirecting energy inward. I paid closer attention to my own finances, not out of fear, but out of intention. I reviewed documents I had been postponing. I organized the information I had kept loosely in my head. Not because I was planning anything dramatic, but because clarity felt grounding. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sober. This wasn't about winning. It was about no longer losing myself quietly. I started to understand that in families under constant financial pressure, there is often an unspoken hierarchy. Those who struggle are protected. Those who manage are used. Breaking that hierarchy doesn't require confrontation. It requires refusing to play your assigned role. And the moment you stop playing it, even gently, everything else begins to wobble. They hadn't noticed yet, but they would. While everything on the surface stayed the same, something quiet and methodical was happening underneath. No one noticed because no one was looking. I didn't announce that I was paying closer attention. I didn't hint that I was preparing for anything. Outwardly, I remained exactly who I had always been: calm, reasonable, unproblematic. But internally, I had shifted from endurance to assessment. I began to observe patterns the way you do when you're no longer emotionally entangled, without judgment, without urgency, just clarity. I noticed how often my name came up when money was tight, even if no one spoke to me directly. I noticed how financial decisions were made with the assumption that I would step in if something went wrong. I noticed how responsibilities quietly migrated toward me while credit rarely followed. And I started documenting, not in a dramatic sense, but in a practical one. I wrote things down in the small leather notebook I always carried: dates, amounts. Conversations are summarized in neutral language. Not because I planned to confront anyone, but because I wanted an accurate record. For the first time, I treated my family dynamics with the same discipline I applied to my professional life: emotionally detached, fact focused. That distance changed everything. I realized how many informal financial entanglements I had allowed to exist: shared expenses that were never fully reconciled, loans that were never acknowledged as such, temporary support that had become permanent expectations. None of it was illegal. None of it was overtly abusive. But it was unsustainable, and I was the only one tracking it. I also started learning, not in a rushed way, but steadily. I refreshed my understanding of personal finance laws, obligations, and boundaries. I revisited documents I had signed casually years earlier. I asked quiet questions of professionals, not naming names, not pointing fingers, just gathering information. Knowledge, I discovered, is a form of leverage that doesn't announce itself. The more I understood the structure I was part of, the less emotional it felt. It wasn't personal, it was systemic. My family wasn't consciously exploiting me. They were responding to incentives and habits reinforced over years of stress. I had made myself the path of least resistance, and now I was quietly removing that path. What they didn't notice was how my availability changed shape. I was still present, but no longer reactive, still kind, but no longer automatic, still supportive, but within limits they hadn't realized existed. They mistook my calm for compliance. They assumed my consistency meant permanence. Meanwhile, I was building something else entirely: options. I made sure my finances were fully separated. I closed informal arrangements. I simplified accounts. I aligned everything with clarity and independence. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't explain, because explanations invite negotiation, and I wasn't negotiating my autonomy anymore. What surprised me most was how peaceful this phase felt. There was no rush, no adrenaline, just a steady sense of alignment. I wasn't planning to punish anyone. I wasn't trying to teach a lesson. I was simply preparing to step out of a system that had quietly consumed more of me than I realized. And preparation is invisible by design. The people around me remained focused on immediate concerns: bills, emergencies, short term fixes. No one was thinking long term, except me. That asymmetry mattered. Because when one person in a system begins to think beyond survival, they gain a kind of quiet advantage, not over others, but over the situation itself. I could see multiple futures clearly now. One where I continued as the unacknowledged stabilizer. One where I confronted everything and fractured relationships. And one where I simply exited the role. Not dramatically, not angrily, just cleanly. I hadn't chosen yet. But I was no longer trapped by ignorance or obligation. What they never noticed was that the version of me they depended on was slowly becoming obsolete. And when a system depends on someone who has already moved on internally, the consequences don't show up immediately. They arrive later, all at once. The reveal didn't come from a confrontation, it came from understanding. One evening, alone at my dining table, surrounded by neatly stacked papers and my open notebook, I saw the full picture for the first time, not emotionally, structurally. What I had thought of as generosity was, in practice, a quiet dependency loop. I had always assumed my family needed me occasionally. But when I laid everything out, timelines, money flows, assumptions, unspoken expectations, I realized something unsettling. My presence wasn't supplemental, it was foundational. Not because I gave the most money, but because I reduced the risk. I was the safety net that people didn't acknowledge, because acknowledging it would require accountability. As long as I stayed calm and available, others could afford to make short term decisions without long term planning. That was the leverage. Not power over people, but power over outcomes. I saw how often decisions had been made with an invisible clause attached. Hannah will help if this goes wrong. They never said it out loud. They didn't need to. The system had been trained that way, and I had helped train it. That realization wasn't accompanied by anger. It was accompanied by clarity so sharp it felt almost physical, like finally adjusting a lens you didn't know was out of focus. I understood then that my value in the family wasn't emotional closeness, it was predictability. And predictability, once withdrawn, changes everything. I sat there for a long time, not moving, not reacting, just letting the understanding settle. This wasn't a secret someone else was hiding from me. It was a truth I had avoided seeing because it implicated me too. I had been rewarded for not needing. I had been trusted for not demanding. I had been relying on not setting limits. That combination creates a role that feels noble from the inside, but looks very different once you step back. The private reveal wasn't about discovering wrongdoing, it was about discovering a position. I realized that if I chose to disengage financially and emotionally at the same time, not coldly, not cruelly, just clearly, the entire balance would shift. Not immediately, but inevitably. And that meant I had a choice most people don't realize they have. I could keep absorbing the cost quietly. I could confront everyone and demand change. Or I could remove the invisible scaffolding and let the system reveal itself. The third option was the cleanest. No accusations, no moral arguments, no debates about intention. Just absence. Absence of overfunctioning. Absence of silent rescue. Absence of assumed availability. That night, I closed my notebook and didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm in a way that only comes when you stop lying to yourself. I knew then that whatever happened next would be irreversible, not because of conflict, but because awareness doesn't go backward. Once you see your leverage, you can't unknow it. Once you see the role you play, you can't keep playing it unconsciously. I also understood something else, just as clearly. If I stayed, nothing would fundamentally change. If I left the role, everything would. And the people around me wouldn't understand what had shifted, only that something essential was suddenly missing. That wasn't my goal, but it was the truth. I slept well that night, not because I had a plan, but because I had honesty. For the first time, my silence wasn't protective or strategic. It was resolved. Once you see clearly, indecision becomes its own kind of action. I spent several weeks living in that clarity, moving through my days normally, while internally weighing the paths in front of me. I didn't rush the decision. I wanted to be sure that whatever I chose wasn't fueled by resentment or fatigue alone. I considered confronting everyone, sitting them down, explaining how the dynamic had affected me, asking for change. It was the most obvious option and the least effective. I knew how those conversations would go. There would be apologies, justifications, promises to do better, and slowly, inevitably, things would return to normal. Because systems built under pressure don't shift through awareness alone, they shift when incentives change. I also considered staying exactly as I was, accepting the role fully without resistance, leaning into being the stabilizer and finding meaning in that identity. But when I imagined that future, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Not fear, finality. As if I would be choosing disappearance over discomfort. That left the third option, quiet disengagement, not cutting anyone off, not making dramatic exits, not weaponizing silence, simply changing my participation in irreversible ways. I knew this option would be misunderstood, that people might think I was distant, busy, or indifferent. I accepted that. Understanding, I realized, was not a requirement for self respect. The irreversible part wasn't emotional withdrawal, it was structural change. Once I removed myself from the financial and logistical backbone of the family, there would be no easy way to reinstate the old dynamic. And I was careful. I made sure I wasn't acting impulsively. I checked my motivations again and again. Was I doing this to punish? To prove a point? To make someone feel something? Each time, the answer was no. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vengeful. I was done negotiating my worth through usefulness. That distinction mattered to me. The decision crystallized one quiet morning as I reviewed my notes, my accounts, and my calendar. Nothing dramatic happened. No triggering call, no final insult, just alignment. I realized that waiting for the right moment was another form of avoidance. The right moment wasn't coming because nothing was broken enough to force it. So I chose timing over drama. I set a date, not to confront anyone, but to complete the final steps of disengagement. Administrative, legal, practical. Things that don't ask for permission. As I moved forward, I felt something surprising. Grief. Not for the people, exactly, but for the version of myself that believed being endlessly reliable would eventually lead to being deeply known. Letting go of that hope hurt more than I expected. But grief is often the price of clarity. I reminded myself of something simple. Staying silent in a system that erases you is not kindness, it's self abandonment. And I wasn't willing to keep doing that. The choice I made that day closed certain doors permanently. Not because others wouldn't want me back in the role, but because I wouldn't fit into it anymore. Once you step out of a structure consciously, you can't pretend you belong to it unconsciously again. That was the point of no return. I didn't feel powerful. I felt grounded. And grounding, I learned, is far more durable than validation. When people imagine change, they picture motion, announcements, reactions, visible turning points. What actually changes systems is paperwork. I moved quietly, deliberately, and without emotional commentary. Not because I was hiding, but because there was nothing to explain. I untangled myself from shared responsibilities first. Anything informal, assumed, or temporary that had lingered for years, I resolved. I closed loops. I simplified arrangements. I removed ambiguity. No speeches, no warnings, just completion. I updated beneficiaries. I revised authorizations. I made sure that no one could accidentally or conveniently rely on me without my explicit consent. These weren't hostile acts, they were acts of clarity. I also changed my availability, not abruptly, not dramatically. I stopped being the default yes. I responded on my timeline. I declined without justification. I can't take that on. I won't be able to help with this. I have other commitments. Each sentence was calm, neutral, unemotional. And because I didn't over explain, there was nothing to argue with. What struck me was how long it took for anyone to notice. People adapted at first. They found workarounds. They leaned on each other. They assumed my absence was temporary, that I'd step back in once things became uncomfortable enough. They mistook my consistency for delay. Meanwhile, I was building something steadier than reactions. Independence from expectation. I didn't correct misunderstandings. If someone assumed I was busy, I let them. If they thought I was distracted, I didn't clarify. Explanations would have softened the impact, and softness would have delayed the inevitable reckoning. This wasn't cruelty, it was a restraint. I still showed up emotionally, but it felt reciprocal. I still listened. I still cared. But I stopped buffering consequences. And slowly, the strain shifted outward. Decisions that had once been easy became complicated. Conversations circled without resolution. Tension lingered, where I used to smooth it over quietly. No one named it yet, but something essential was missing. The absence wasn't dramatic. It was logistical, emotional, structural, and that's why it mattered. You can ignore feelings, you can dismiss intentions, but you can't argue with missing infrastructure. The family system had been leaning on me the way buildings lean on load bearing walls, not noticing the support until it's removed. And I had removed myself cleanly. I didn't feel guilty, not because I didn't care, but because guilt requires wrongdoing, and I hadn't done anything wrong. I had simply stopped subsidizing the imbalance. What surprised me most was how peaceful this phase felt. Not empowering in a loud way, just quiet, steady, certain. I slept better. I spoke less defensively. I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head because I wasn't bracing for anything. I wasn't waiting to be seen anymore. I had already seen myself. The consequences hadn't fully arrived yet. But I could sense them forming, not as punishment, but as gravity. Systems adjust when their supports are removed. People notice when what they relied on disappears. They just don't always know why, and soon they would feel it. The consequences didn't arrive with confrontation, they arrived in confusion. At first, it was subtle. Conversations stretched longer than usual. Decisions stalled. Small issues that once resolved themselves began to linger. People sounded tired, not overwhelmed in the dramatic sense, just worn down by the accumulation of things that no longer smoothed themselves out. I noticed the change before anyone said it out loud. There were more group messages, more last minute coordination, more, does anyone know how to? Questions are floating unanswered for longer than usual. I watched without stepping in, not because I didn't know the answers, but because I wasn't responsible for maintaining a system that no longer included me by default. The first direct comment came casually. "You've been busy lately," someone said. Not accusatory, just observant. I nodded. "I've been focusing on my own things." That was it. No explanation, no reassurance. The silence that followed wasn't hostile, but it was new. Soon after, the tone shifted. Requests became more explicit, less assumed. "Could you help with this? Do you have time to look at something?" And when I said no, politely, calmly, the reactions were telling. Surprise, pause, adjustment, not anger, because anger would have required entitlement. And on some level, they knew they didn't have it. What they had was dependence without awareness, and awareness was beginning to form. The real consequences emerged not in words but in strain. Financial decisions carried more weight. Mistakes became visible. Emotional tension surfaced where it had been quietly absorbed before. I wasn't blamed. I wasn't confronted, but I was noticed. And being noticed, after years of invisibility, felt strangely neutral, not satisfying, not vindicating, just factual. I saw panic flicker briefly in moments when someone realized there was no silent backup, no unspoken safety net waiting to catch the fall. Those moments passed quickly, but they accumulated. And slowly, the narrative shifted. She's not as available as she used to be. She's changed. She's doing her own thing now. All true. None of it required defense. What struck me most was that no one asked why. Not really. They were too busy managing the consequences of a missing role to examine how that role had been created. And that was okay. Change doesn't always come with understanding. Sometimes it arrives as an inconvenience first. I didn't gloat. I didn't withdraw affection. I remained exactly as I was, except for the part that had been quietly overextended. I was no longer cushioning the system, and systems feel that loss immediately. The emotional atmosphere grew heavier, not because of conflict, but because accountability had returned to where it belonged. I felt a quiet sadness during this phase, not regret, but mourning. I saw people I cared about struggling with responsibilities I had once shielded them from. And there was a part of me that wanted to step back in, to ease the pressure. But I didn't, because relief would have been temporary, and the cost would have been my erasure. I reminded myself that discomfort is not cruelty, that growth often feels like loss before it feels like balance. The consequences were no longer theoretical, they lived. And there was no way to rewind without fully undoing what I had chosen. I stayed calm. I stayed kind. I stayed out of the way. And the system continued to adjust. Awkwardly, imperfectly, but honestly. The moment when panic appeared wasn't loud. It never is. When it arrives too late. By then, the system had already shifted. Responsibilities had redistributed themselves unevenly. Small cracks had widened. What used to be manageable through quiet compensation now requires visible effort. That's when people started asking questions, not the kind that seek understanding, but the kind that hope for restoration. Can we talk? Things feel different lately. We might need your help again. The words were careful, almost gentle, but beneath them was urgency, not about me, but about stability. I listened. That alone was a change. Before, I would have filled the silence with reassurance. I would have explained myself, softened the edges, made things easier to digest. This time, I let their words land. I realized something important in those conversations. They weren't asking how I felt. They were asking whether the old structure could be rebuilt. And it couldn't. Not because I refused, but because I no longer fit inside it. Once you step out of a role consciously, returning to it feels like pretending you didn't grow. There were moments of regret on their side. I could see it in their expressions, the way they spoke more carefully now, as if politeness could reverse momentum. If we'd known you felt this way, we didn't realize how much you were carrying. Those sentences came close to accountability, but they stopped just short of responsibility. They were acknowledgments of impact, not of cause. And even if they had gone further, even if apologies had been perfectly worded, it wouldn't have changed the outcome. Because this wasn't about being heard, it was about timing. Care offered after withdrawal doesn't restore trust. It only confirms that presence was required to be missed before it was valued. That realization was painful, but also clarifying. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I didn't reopen old wounds. I simply explained calmly that my capacity had changed, that I was no longer able to participate in the same way. I'm focusing on my own life now. I can't be the backup plan anymore. There was silence after that. Not hostile, not dramatic, just final. I could see the moment when they understood, not emotionally but practically, that something essential was gone. Not me, the role. And roles, once abandoned, don't reattach easily. There was frustration after that, confusion, a sense of unfairness that hovered without being spoken. Why now? Why like this? Why without warning? But warnings had been everywhere, just quiet enough to ignore. I felt empathy in that moment, genuine empathy. Change is destabilizing, especially when it exposes a reliance you didn't know you had. But empathy doesn't require reversal. I held my ground without hardening. I didn't become distant or cold. I remained present, just not absorbent. And that distinction made all the difference. What they wanted was resolution. What existed instead was consequence. And consequences don't negotiate. By the time everyone fully grasped what had changed, there was nothing left to fix, only something new to build. Without me at the center, that truth settled slowly, unevenly, but permanently. I walked away from those conversations lighter than I expected. Not relieved, but intact. Because for the first time, my presence was no longer conditional on what I could provide. And that, once established, cannot be undone. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't look like one. There was no raised voice, no list of grievances, no emotional spillover, just a quiet meeting, initiated not out of anger, but necessity. We sat together, calmly, awkwardly, aware that something fundamental had shifted, and there was no pretending otherwise. They spoke first, carefully, measured, as if volume might trigger something irreversible. They talked about how things had become harder, how they felt unprepared, how they missed the way things used to work. I listened. That too was different. Before, listening meant absorbing responsibility. Now, It meant simply hearing. When it was my turn, I didn't explain the entire history. I didn't defend my decision. I didn't enumerate the ways I had been overlooked. I said only what was necessary. I didn't leave because I was angry. I left because the role I was in wasn't healthy for me anymore. There was a pause. Someone asked quietly why I hadn't said something sooner. And for a moment, I considered all the answers, the subtle dismissals, the normalized expectations, the way silence had been interpreted as consent. But I chose restraint. I did, I said, just not loudly. That was the closest thing to a confrontation in the room. There were questions after that. Not accusations, more like attempts to map unfamiliar territory. What do we do now? Can things go back to how they were? I answered honestly, no. But that doesn't mean things have to be worse. That statement landed heavily because it reframed the situation, not as loss, but as transition. I wasn't rejecting them, I was redefining myself. And redefining yourself doesn't require permission. I made it clear that I still cared, that I wasn't withdrawing emotionally, but I was no longer willing to be the unspoken stabilizer. If I helped, it would be intentional. If I participated, it would be mutual. If I gave, it would be visible. No more invisible labor, no more assumed capacity. There was discomfort in the room, not because of hostility, but because clarity had replaced familiarity, and clarity removes ambiguity. They couldn't argue with my tone. I wasn't defensive. I wasn't emotional. I wasn't asking for validation. I was simply stating reality. That kind of confrontation doesn't escalate, it settles. By the end of the conversation, nothing was resolved in the traditional sense. No apologies neatly tied with promises, no grand reconciliation. But something else had happened. The old dynamic had been acknowledged, not dissected, but recognized. And recognition, even without agreement, is enough to end a pattern. We parted quietly, cordially, changed. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt aligned. For the first time, I wasn't playing a role while sitting across from the people who had shaped me. I was just myself, and that was enough. I didn't become someone new overnight. There was no dramatic reinvention, no sudden confidence, no symbolic gesture marked a clear before and after. What changed was quieter than that. I stopped performing stability for other people. That decision altered how I moved through my days in ways that were almost invisible at first. I spoke more slowly. I paused before responding. I no longer rushed to fill silences or solve problems that weren't mine. And in that space, something unexpected emerged. Myself. Without the constant pull of expectation, I noticed how much of my identity had been shaped by anticipation. Anticipating needs, anticipating outcomes, anticipating disappointment. I had been living one step ahead of everyone else, not out of anxiety, but out of training. Now I was present. I still cared deeply about my family. That never changed. But the care was no longer asymmetrical. I wasn't compensating for the imbalance. I wasn't trading my capacity for belonging. I learned to let relationships show me what they were capable of without reinforcement. Some grew quieter. Some grew awkward. Some surprised me by adapting. And that was okay. I no longer measured closeness by usefulness. I no longer mistook responsibility for love. The most profound shift was internal. I stopped needing to be understood to feel secure. There is a particular freedom that comes when you accept that not everyone will fully grasp your decisions and that their understanding is not the price of your peace. I noticed how calm I felt in situations that used to trigger me. Money conversations no longer tightened my chest. Family gatherings no longer required emotional armor. Because I wasn't hiding anymore. Not hiding my needs, not hiding my limits, not hiding behind competence. I allowed myself to be unremarkable in rooms where I used to feel obligated to be exceptional. And that changed how I saw myself. I wasn't the strong one. I wasn't the reliable one. I was just a person, complex, finite, deserving of care without earning it. That realization didn't make me bitter about the past. It softened me toward it. I could see how easily roles form in families under pressure, how survival instincts masquerade as values, how love can become conditional without anyone intending harm. I didn't blame anyone, not even myself. I had done what I needed to survive. Now, I was doing what I needed to live. The quiet dominance people sometimes notice in me now doesn't come from control. It comes from alignment, from knowing my boundaries so clearly that I don't need to defend them. I don't argue about my worth. I don't over explain my choices. I don't step in unless invited. And when I do, it's because I want to, not because I'm expected to. That difference has reshaped every relationship in my life, including the one I have with myself. I'm no longer invisible, but I am also no longer trying to be seen. I am present. I am whole. And I am finally at peace with the space I occupy. For a long time, I thought love was proven through endurance, through staying, through absorbing, through being the one who never made things harder. In my family, love was measured by money, not greedily, not cruelly, but practically. Whoever needed help received attention. Whoever caused the strain became the focus. And whoever remained steady was quietly expected to keep holding everything up. I don't think anyone meant for it to work that way. I don't think anyone woke up intending to turn usefulness into worth. But intention doesn't erase impact. What I learned, slowly, quietly, is that when financial pressure becomes the organizing force of a family, emotional bonds don't disappear, they get distorted. Care becomes reactive, presence becomes conditional, and the people who ask for the least often give the most until they disappear. This story isn't a warning against helping your family. It's a reminder to notice how you're helping and what it costs you. There is a difference between generosity and self erasure, between being dependable and being unseeable, between peace and silence that only protects everyone else. Quiet dominance isn't about power over people, it's about power over participation. It's the ability to step back without hostility, to choose absence over argument, to let systems reveal themselves instead of trying to fix them alone. Walking away from a role doesn't mean you stop loving the people who benefited from it. It means you stop confusing your capacity with your identity. When I stopped being the invisible safety net, nothing collapsed permanently. Things adjusted. People adapted. Some relationships changed shape. Some grew more honest. Some became more distant. That's the truth no one prepares you for. When you stop overfunctioning, you don't destroy relationships. You clarify them. And clarity, while uncomfortable, is not cruel. If there's one thing I hope this story leaves you with, it's this. You don't have to be needed to be worthy. You don't have to struggle visibly to deserve care. And you don't have to stay silent to be considered mature. Sometimes, the most self respecting thing you can do is stop filling the gap and let the space speak. Not loudly, not angrily, just honestly. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been the strong one, the reliable one, the person who held everything together quietly, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever stepped out of a role that once defined you? And what did it reveal about the people around you?